question hit the hearing room like a detonation. Director Patel, are you China's spy? Not a metaphor, not a political talking point, a direct, on-the-record accusation aimed at the most powerful law enforcement officer in America. The kind of question that doesn't just end careers. It rewrites them. For 17 suffocating seconds, FBI Director Kash Patel, the man whose entire brand was fearless directness, sat frozen at the witness table, his jaw locked, his knuckles pressing into the wood. Because the congressman from Georgia hadn't just asked a question, he had already done the math, and the math was devastating. But this story doesn't begin in that hearing room. It begins with a stock certificate, a $5 million stock certificate. In a company with roots buried deep inside the country, Patel was being paid by the American taxpayer to investigate. Hank Johnson had been watching Patel for months, not with admiration, with the quiet, dangerous patience of a man building a case. But he was methodical. And that morning, he walked into the hearing room carrying something far more lethal than a soundbite. He had the paper trail, every disclosure form, every ownership record, every link between Kash Patel, a holding company called Elite Depot, and the single greatest national security threat America had ever faced. Director Patel, have you held any stock in any companies founded in China? It froze, because every experienced Hill observer understood immediately what Johnson was doing. He already knew the answer. He was handing Patel the rope. Patel shifted slightly in his chair. His voice carried its usual confidence. But something behind his eyes flickered for just a fraction of a second. Not that I'm aware of, he said. He slid the document forward and read the name out loud. Elite Depot, a company Patel had disclosed during his confirmation process. Buried in the fine print, counted on to be forgotten. Johnson hadn't forgotten. He had traced the ownership chain, entity by entity, continent by continent, until he landed on a name, Shein, the fast fashion giant, the data harvesting machine, a company founded in China by a Chinese billionaire with alleged ties to the Chinese Communist Party. Patel's jaw tightened. I believe that's a law firm, based in Singapore. The kind of silence that only works when you're holding the paper that proves the man across from you just lied. Or worse, has no idea what he actually owns. That law firm in Singapore, Johnson said, his voice dropping into a precision strike calm, is owned by Elite Depot, which is owned by a Chinese billionaire, and you hold stock in it, up to $5 million worth, as of your most recent disclosure. The color didn't drain from Patel's face all at once. It happened in stages. The way a building comes down. First the frame, then everything else. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't about the deep state or Trump. It wasn't about the deep state or bureau reform. The FBI, Patel's FBI, exists for one core mission: hunting the enemies of the United States. And since his first day in office, Patel had stood at podiums, sat before cameras, and declared with total conviction that China was America's #1 national security threat. Not Russia, not Iran, China. The Chinese Communist Party, the entity that steals American intellectual property, harvests American data, recruits American officials, and runs the most sophisticated espionage operation in human history. And while Kash Patel delivered those speeches, while he directed thousands of FBI agents to hunt Chinese infiltration, he was personally profiting from a company rooted in that same country. Johnson leaned into the microphone. Trump's trade policy directly affects the value of that Chinese stock. Would you agree with that? Patel blinked. Which policy exactly? I'm not a trade analyst. The director of the FBI, the man responsible for counterintelligence operations against the world's most sophisticated economic adversary, was suddenly not an analyst the moment his own portfolio was on the table. From where I'm sitting, it looks like you're putting your personal financial interest ahead of national security. That's the textbook definition of the fox guarding the henhouse. The composure, that legendary camera-trained, never-flinch composure, broke open. His voice sharpened into something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear. It lived in the space between. I reject that characterization, he said, biting off each word. Didn't give him an inch, because the documents were still sitting on the table. And documents don't have emotions. The FBI is tasked with investigating economic espionage carried out by companies tied to the Chinese Communist Party, Johnson continued, his pace deliberate, each word landing like a brick. You run the FBI, and you hold a financial stake in exactly that kind of company. That is a conflict of interest. Patel's hands tightened, his thumb pressed white against the edge of the table. The microphone picked up the sound of him swallowing. So why are you still holding that stock? Johnson asked. Simple, clean, impossible to dodge. That wasn't a call I made, and inside them the most extraordinary admission of the entire morning. The man running America's premier law enforcement agency had just told Congress and went on live television that he didn't control what happened with his own money. Someone else had made that decision for him. Who made that call? And the bigger one underneath it, why? Director Patel, are you embarrassed? That's the question hanging in the air that no procedure manual can answer. Not the ethics review that cleared the stock, not the disclosure filed during confirmation, not the legal memo that justified keeping it. Because being legal and being right are not the same thing. And the people watching that hearing understood in real time that the man sworn to protect them from Chinese influence was still drawing value from a Chinese billionaire's empire. Does Trump know what Patel has been sitting on? That question deserves its own investigation. Because if the administration signed off on an FBI director holding $5 million in Chinese-linked assets while running counterintelligence operations against Beijing, this stops being a story about one man's stock portfolio. It becomes a story about who the FBI director is actually working for. And if Trump didn't know, that's its own kind of alarm, because it means whoever cleared Patel's ethics paperwork made a choice. A choice to bury it in disclosure language, a choice to bet that no one in Congress would bother doing the math. Patel tried to pivot. He reached for numbers. Over 1,000 arrests tied to predatory networks, a sharp rise in counterintelligence cases opened since he took the chair. Johnson sliced through it without raising his voice once. Every one of those cases was already moving before you walked in the door. You're standing here taking a bow for someone else's work. Because Johnson was right, and the room knew it. The investigations behind those numbers had been opened, staffed, and funded long before Patel arrived. He had walked into a machine that was already running and was presenting its exhaust as his own engine. But that deflection exposed something even bigger than the original stock question. Pressed on the China holdings, he pivoted to his record. Pressed on his record, he pivoted to the last administration. Every exit from accountability simply opened onto another exit. Not once, not for a single second, did he say, "You're right, I should have sold it." Here's what the American people deserve to understand. China doesn't need to plant a spy inside the FBI with a badge and a service weapon. That's not how modern intelligence operations work anymore. What China needs is access, leverage, a financial thread tying a decision maker to interests that can never be fully untangled from Beijing. A thread that doesn't even need to be pulled. It just has to exist. Knowing China is America's #1 threat, and still profiting from it, is not a gray area. That's a firing offense. Every ethics rule, every conflict of interest statute, every standard applied to every other federal employee points to the same conclusion. This should have ended before it began, and yet the chair is still occupied. Is that thread sitting inside Kash Patel's portfolio right now? Director Patel, are you profiting off the very country you swore an oath to stop? Because $5 million in Chinese-linked assets isn't a footnote, and the American people deserve to hear you say it yourself, on the record. And it's the question Hank Johnson asked, on the record, under oath, documents in hand, while every camera in that room captured the moment the director of the FBI couldn't produce an answer that satisfied anyone. Because the hearing didn't end in a resignation. It didn't end in a subpoena. It didn't end with the dramatic reckoning American democracy promises but almost never delivers. It ended with a chairman calling time, the cameras swinging to the next questioner, and Kash Patel adjusting his jacket and moving on like nothing had happened. But the document is still on that table. The ownership chain is still on the record. And the $5 million is still out there, rising and falling with every decision Washington makes about Beijing. Somewhere inside the J. Edgar Hoover building, agents who have spent entire careers risking everything to expose foreign financial entanglements in other people are watching their own director explain why his foreign entanglement is somehow different, somehow not what it looks like. Director Patel, the American people are still waiting, not for a legal memo, not for a DOJ review, for one simple answer to one simple question. If China is the enemy, why is the enemy still funding your portfolio? And think about the scale of what that question really touches. At any given moment, the FBI is running hundreds of active counterintelligence cases targeting Chinese state-linked actors. Those cases involve choices: who gets surveilled, what resources get deployed, which leads get prioritized, when to move and when to wait. The director shapes those choices. The director's instincts become the Bureau's instincts. And if that director holds a financial stake that benefits, even slightly, even theoretically, from calm, undisturbed US-China relations, then asking whether that stake shapes those decisions isn't paranoia. It's the entire reason conflict of interest rules exist in the first place. Patel knows this better than almost anyone. He built his name exposing exactly this kind of entanglement in other officials. He used it as a weapon to push people out of their jobs. And then he sat on $5 million tied to a Chinese billionaire's company and told Congress it simply wasn't his call. And the cameras caught every second of the moment Kash Patel realized this particular question had no clean way out, no deflection smooth enough, no statistic big enough to make $5 million in Chinese-linked equity vanish from the public record. Now we want to hear from you. Because this isn't over. Why is Trump keeping Patel in that seat? Is it because Patel is genuinely the best person for the job, or because the president and his FBI director have unfinished business that only works if Patel stays exactly where he is? And while you sit with that, does a $5 million Chinese stock position disqualify Patel from overseeing a single China-related investigation at the FBI? Drop your answer below, because the people in Washington clearly aren't asking these questions loud enough. But you can.